Assalamu alaikum, very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another episode of Perceptive Learning Zone. And today we are going to be talking about the US-Iran conflict. I'm your mentor, Hamza Nasser, and today we start by discussing the historical origins of this conflict. You see, fellas, the hostility now between the United States and Iran, it did not appear suddenly in recent years. It has its roots stretching back more than 7 decades, and it is deeply intertwined with the, with the political transformations of the modern Middle East. Now, if you talk about the early Cold War era, Iran was not an enemy of Washington. In fact, it was considered one of the United States' most important regional partners. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran was seen as a strategic pillar in the Western effort to counter the Soviet influence in the region. American investment, it flowed into Iran's oil sector. The Iranian military, it received advanced Western equipment, and political relations between Tehran and Washington were close. The turning point, I would say, it came in 1953. It came in 1953 when the United States and the United Kingdom, they supported a covert operation that removed Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, after he nationalized the country's oil industry. So Western governments, they feared that Mossadegh's policies, they threatened their energy interests, and this might actually end up pushing Iran closer to the Soviet Union. So the coup, it restored the Shah's authority and allowed Western oil companies to regain influence over Iranian resources. Now, although this intervention, fellas, it stabilized Western interests at the time, it planted deep resentment within Iranian society. Many Iranians, they came to view the Shah's government as being heavily dependent on foreign support, and opposition to his rule, it gradually intensified over the next 2 decades. By the late 1970s, dissatisfaction with the monarchy, it had reached an absolute boiling point. You see, fellas, there was economic inequality, there was political repression, there was anger over foreign influence, and this triggered massive protests across Iran. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and replaced the monarchy with an Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini. And the revolution, it dramatically reshaped Iran's political identity and its relationship with the West. The new leadership, it rejected the pro-Western orientation of the previous government, and it framed its ideology basically around independence from foreign domination. Now, what we feel is that later the same year, the crisis that permanently transformed US-Iran relations occurred. Iranian students, they stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 US diplomats hostage for 444 days. The hostage crisis, it shocked the United States and became a defining moment in American public consciousness. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were severed, and decades of hostility followed. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, tensions continued to grow. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, the United States supported Iraq with intelligence as well as logistical assistance, while Iran accused Washington of attempting to weaken the Islamic Republic. Several violent incidents during this period, including attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf and the tragic downing of Iran Air Flight 655 by US naval vessel in 1988, it deepened the level of mistrust that was perpetuating between the two nations, right? So from that point onward, the relationship, it evolved into one of persistent rivalry. Instead of direct warfare, the two countries confronted each other through sanctions, covert operations, and influence struggles across the Middle East, and the hostility, it became embedded in both the nations', political narratives. And this shaped policy decision and public perception for decades. Also, there were some long-term contributing factors as well. You see, fellas, the US-Iran rivalry, it has endured because it is driven by several deep structural issues that repeatedly generate tension even when diplomatic negotiations occur. One of the most significant disputes, it is concerning Iran's nuclear program. Iran began developing nuclear technology in the 1950s with Western support, but after the 1979 revolution, the program became controversial. Western governments, they grew increasingly, concerned that Iran's uranium enrichment capabilities, they could eventually allow the production of nuclear weapons, of mass destruction. Iran has consistently insisted that its nuclear activities are intended for peaceful purposes, such as electricity generation, such as medical research, right? The disagreement, it led to years of international negotiations and economic sanctions. And in 2050, Iran and 6 world powers, they reached the JCPOA, that stands for Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and this was basically an agreement that limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. However, the agreement, it faced political challenges and eventually collapsed after the United States withdrew from it in 2018, reigniting tensions. Also, we feel like another major long-term factor is the network of regional alliances that Iran has cultivated over decades. Iran has built relationships with armed groups and political movements across the Middle East, who are often referred to as part of the axis of resistance. These groups, they include Hezbollah. They include Hezbollah in Lebanon. They include militias in Iraq. They include allied fractions in Syria and Yemen. So from Iran's perspective, ladies and gentlemen, these alliances, quintessentially speaking, they provide strategic depth and deterrence against external threats. From the viewpoint of the United States and its allies, however, these groups are seen as destabilizing forces that threaten regional security. Also, economic sanctions have also played a central role in shaping the conflict. Over the years, the United States and its partners, they imposed multiple rounds of sanctions targeting Iran's oil exports, financial institutions, as well as access to international markets. And these measures were intended to pressurize Iran into changing its policies regarding nuclear development and regional activities. While sanctions significantly constrained Iran's economy, causing inflation, currency depreciation, and reduced oil revenue, they also strengthened anti-Western sentiment within segments of Iranian society. Also, ideological differences, they further complicate relations. Iranian leaders, they frequently describe the United States as a global power seeking to dominate Muslim societies, while American policymakers often characterize Iran as a state that supports militant groups and undermines stability in the Middle East, right? These narratives, they are reinforcing mutual distrust, and they are making diplomatic compromise politically difficult for both the sides. Also, let's talk about the road to war, the escalation. The decade of the 2020s, it witnessed a steady escalation in tensions between Iran, the United States, and regional allies. All the confrontations had occurred before, fellas. The frequency as well as the intensity of incidents, it increased dramatically during this period. One factor was the growing pattern of proxy attacks in Iraq and Syria. Militias aligned with Iran, they carried out numerous rocket and drone strikes against U.S. military installments in the region. These attacks were often described as retaliation for American sanctions or military presence in the Middle East. The U.S. forces, they responded with targeted airstrikes. They responded with targeted airstrikes against militia positions, hence creating a cycle of retaliation that heightened the risk of wider conflict. Also, another critical development, it was the intensifying confrontation between Iran and Israel. Israeli leaders have long considered Iran's nuclear program a strategic threat, and they've conducted covert operations aimed at slowing its progress. And these operations, they included cyber attacks, sabotage of nuclear facilities, as well as targeted killing of Iran's nuclear scientists. And tensions, they escalated rapidly, fellas, in April 2024, when an Israeli strike on an Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus killed several senior officers from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And Iran viewed the attack as a direct assault on its sovereignty. The situation it deteriorated further in 2025 when Israel launched a series of large-scale strikes against Iranian military and nuclear facilities. The confrontation lasted approximately 12 days and involved missile exchange and involved drone attacks as well as airstrikes across multiple locations. The reports now, they indicated that more than 600 people were killed in Iran, while dozens were killed in Israel. The United States later conducted strikes targeting Iranian nuclear infrastructure, signaling deeper involvement in the confrontation. By the beginning of 2026, this region was already tense, fellas, and military forces on all sides were on heightened alert, and analysts warned that a single miscalculation could give rise to a much larger war, and that single miscalculation arrived in 2026, right? So let's talk about the 2026 war and major military developments. The current phase of the conflict, it escalated dramatically in early 2026 when the United States and Israel, they launched coordinated strikes against Iranian targets. Their operations were designed to degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and weaken the command structure of the Revolutionary Guard forces. The campaign, it involved large-scale air and missile strikes targeting nuclear facilities, military bases, air defense systems, as well as logistical infrastructure. Advanced aircraft, cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions, they were used to strike dozens of locations across Iran. Reports suggested that command centers, radar installations, as well as storage facilities were among the major targets. Naval forces, they have also played an important role in this conflict. The Persian Gulf and surrounding waters, they became zones of intense military activity. U.S. and allied naval vessels, the allied naval vessels, they increased the patrols to protect shipping routes as well as energy infrastructure. Several naval engagements have occurred during the early stages of the conflict, including clashes between warships as well as missile launches from coastal installations. And I would say that this war, it has also expanded through regional proxy fronts. Militias that are aligned with Iran in Iraq and Syria, they launched attacks on U.S. bases using rockets, drones, as well as short-range missiles. These groups, they have sought to pressurize American forces across the region and demonstrate that the conflict would simply not remain limited to Iran's territory. And Iran has responded with, I would say, with missile strikes and drone attacks that are targeting U.S. installations and allied facilities in neighboring countries. Some attacks were directed towards strategic bases that were hosting American forces, while other targeted infrastructure linked to energy exports. And the conflict, well, it quickly spread, fellows, beyond a single battlefield. It became a complex regional confrontation involving air warfare, naval operations, cyber activities, as well as proxy engagements. So finally, next up we go on to casualties as well as human cost, right? The human cost of the conflict has been significant. Although precise numbers remain difficult to confirm due to the ongoing nature of the war and the limited access of independent observers, early estimates suggested that more than 1,000 people were killed in Iran during the initial stages of the war, including military personnel and civilians affected by airstrikes. Iranian officials reported damage to infrastructure in several provinces, including industrial facilities and transportation networks. And Israel has also experienced casualties from retaliatory missile strikes launched by Iran and allied groups. Several residential areas were damaged and emergency services responded to multiple incidents involving debris from intercepted missiles. American forces stationed in the region, they have also suffered losses. Military bases targeted by rockets and drones, they reported casualties among service members as well as contractors. Also, beyond the direct battlefield losses, the conflict has caused significant civilian suffering across the broader region. Proxy clashes in countries such as Iraq and Syria have displaced families and damaged local infrastructure, and historically, confrontations have caused hundreds of deaths over the decades in this region. If you talk about, for example, the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, which killed 241 US Marines, and other attacks linked to regional militant groups. So let's talk about the fellas, the economic as well as the global impacts of the US Iran war, right? The conflict has had profound implications for the global economy, particularly in the energy sector. The Persian Gulf region, it contains some of the world's most important oil and gas routes, and any disruption to these pathways can quickly affect international mindsets. It can affect international markets. One of the most critical choke points is the Strait of Hormuz, right? It is a narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes, and the possibility that military operations could threaten shipping in this area has caused anxiety among energy traders and governments worldwide. Oil prices there reacted quickly to the escalation of hostilities, rallying significantly as markets anticipated potential supply disruption. Energy analysts have warned that prolonged instability in the region could push prices even higher, affecting transportation costs, inflation, as well as economic growth in many countries. Shipping companies, they also began rerouting vessels or increasing insurance premiums due to the heightened risk of attacks. And insurance costs for tankers traveling to the Gulf, they rose sharply during the early weeks of the conflict. The financial cost of the war itself has also been substantial. Military operations involving advanced aircraft, naval deployment, and missile systems, they require enormous expenditures. Analysts estimate that billions of dollars have already been spent on the conflict, with the total likely to grow if hostilities continue. So, what are the diplomatic positions and global reactions? The international response to the conflict has been deeply divided. Governments around the world have taken different positions based on strategic alliance, economic interests, as well as regional security concerns. The United States and Israel have argued that their actions are necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and to protect regional stability. Officials from both countries emphasize that Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities, they pose long-term security threats that must be addressed immediately. Iran, on the other hand, has condemned the strike as acts of aggression and violation of international law. Iranian leaders have called for international condemnation of the attacks and have vowed to defend the country's sovereignty. Many European governments have expressed concern about the escalation and have called for restraint from all parties. Diplomats have urged a return to negotiation aimed at reviving nuclear agreements and reducing military tensions. Also, I would say the countries in the Gulf region, they face a particularly complex situation. Some governments share concerns about Iran's regional influence, yet they also fear that a prolonged war could destabilize the entire region and threaten vital economic infrastructure. International organizations, including the United Nations, have repeatedly, over and over again, called for de-escalation and diplomatic dialogue. Emergency meetings have been held in order to discuss humanitarian concerns and the risk of a broader regional war. So, what are the possible future scenarios going forward? Analysts generally outline several possible paths the conflict could take in the coming months and years. One scenario is prolonged regional warfare, where fighting continues across multiple countries through proxy groups and periodic direct strikes. The outcome could lead to sustained instability in the Middle East and significant economic consequences for the global economy. Another possibility is a negotiated diplomatic settlement. Historically, even intense rivalries have sometimes ended with negotiations once both sides reach the limits of military escalation. Renewed talks over nuclear restrictions and regional security arrangements could eventually emerge under international pressure. A third scenario, it involves a major economic crisis triggered by prolonged disruption to energy markets. If shipping to the Strait of Hormuz were severely affected, global oil prices could surge dramatically, creating ripple effects across industries worldwide. Finally, some analysts, they speculate about internal political changes within Iran that could reshape the country's foreign policy. However, such outcomes are highly uncertain, and obviously they depend depend on complex domestic factors as well. So to sum up this long discussion, fellas, to conclude, the US-Iran conflict is a result of the decades of historical grievances, strategic competition, as well as ideological differences. What began as a Cold War alliance, it gradually transformed into one of the most enduring rivalries in modern international politics. And today's, this confrontation today, it reflects not only bilateral tensions, but also the broader geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. And military operations, economic pressure, and diplomatic negotiations, they're all intertwined in a complex web of interests involving multiple countries. As the situation continues to evolve, the decisions made by leaders on all sides will determine whether the conflict expands into a wider regional war or moves towards a fragile but necessary diplomatic resolution. So that'll be all for now, fellas. We'll be back with more invigorating content. Please don't hesitate to like, share, subscribe to Perceptive Learning Zone. And thank you for your support as always. And God bless you all. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.